that is inclusive and really brings in a whole range of stakeholders and starts to open up spaces for participation. So that's the one aspect that we focus very much on. And in our recent work that we've done on climate pathways, I think predictably, noting some of the things that have happened in South Africa and where our emissions are coming from, renewables was an obvious kind of choice. But I think in how we've been able to galvanize the business community and other key stakeholders, particularly government, but labor, as well as your social movements as well, in how do we practically understand what that rollout is going to look like, and then how do we start to have very specific and focused conversations where we need to activate key parts of our economy, what's happening at government level, what the private sector is doing. So that's a very macro, legislative, kind of policy, focused undertaking. But in addition to that, we've also focused very much on profiling the power of your corporates in this space, in what is an emerging space. A lot of now regulations have just been pulled out of the ground. So there's this whole landscape, new and emerging landscape that we are grappling with. And I think it's important to note how the private sector has been quite active in making sure that we are opening up the market, starting to allow a greater range of stakeholders, possible producers, but actors in that value chain into the conversation. Specifically, we're focused on just demonstrating the power of the corporate procurement positioning and how that starts to activate other actors beyond national governments. And then on the other side as well, kind of capacitating companies. We know that they're not all at the same level. They're not all at the same stage, but the opportunity is huge. And from our work, we need everybody to be activated in this space. So it's about providing the platforms where we can share learnings amongst those that are a little bit more mature or further along, those who are a bit hesitant. They want to do it but not sure exactly how to do it, and how do you use that peer-to-peer learning kind of channel, but also then how do we provide the kinds of resources and tools that would allow the private sector to be playing a much, much bigger role in helping us to achieve our renewable energy targets going forward.
Very nice. Thank you so much for that. And I think you've outlined there quite an important piece around the peer-to-peer exchanges that I think really form the power of coalitions. Tom, you come from a massive conglomerate, and tell us a little bit about how you are involved in this sector.
Sure, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully Walmart doesn't need that big an introduction, but we're the world's largest retailer. But what many people often forget is that we also operate in 23 different retail markets around the world from a local store perspective, and a lot of what we're trying to do is take.
Can I swap this with you? It's louder.
How's that? Ooh, yeah, way better. And echoing myself. Okay. Everyone can hear me very well. So a lot of what we do, we set these global goals, these global aspirational goals. So back in 2020, the Walmart CEO set us on course to become a regenerative company. And that's obviously a big tagline, but lots of detail that's sitting underneath that. One of our goals is to become a net zero company by 2040 without carbon offsets and 100% renewable in our own operations by 2035. But these are really big goals, and what we want to try and do is break them down into huge programs in our supply chains and operations. But I think what's really relevant, particularly for this topic, is how we take these lessons that we're doing on a global scale into our individual markets. And very much the tagline is strong local businesses powered by Walmart. And so I think that's what we've seen, is how can we take programs that have existed in different supply chains and different markets and bring them down to specific markets and specific supply chains to try and take those lessons forward.
I really like that point, because I think, when you're looking at a large corporate, there's a lot of smaller scale businesses that feed into that ecosystem, sort of upstream, downstream, the supply chains, the value chains that you're talking about, and getting them all to sort of sign up to the same demand can actually really ratchet up accelerate actually the demand for renewables. And I think that's a very interesting angle. We'll come back to you on that, but maybe coming back to you, Miranda, specifically around some of the challenges. We spoke about how there's a lot of power in creating these coalitions, but I'm sure there's also challenges and lessons that may have been learned along the journey. Could you share a little bit of that with us?
So are you more interested in lessons about the coalition or about the power markets?
Both.
Both. Okay. Well, why don't I start with the power markets?
Okay.
What we see is the single most important component is having a market at all. So in many parts of the world, there are no markets for energy customers. There is one power producer. Sometimes it's completely vertically integrated, and the end customer has no choice. Has no choice of the generation source, has no choice of the provider. So that is one important lesson, an important barrier that policymakers and companies can work on together, is how do we unlock markets so that customers can use their power demand and power procurement to actually accelerate change, and importantly, to provide guaranteed revenue for long periods of time. When you talk to the financiers, the banks that finance the wind projects, the solar projects, what they will often say is, when we have a high quality customer, a Walmart or a Google or a local company who has good credit and has been working in the market for a long time, who's promising to buy the power for the next 10 years, that gives the financier the confidence to fund the project.
Yeah.
But if there's no market available for those buyers to send that signal, then we're really just dependent on the policymakers to set the policy. And we need both, actually. At SIBA, we don't believe that markets alone can get to where the zero carbon power system we need, but if we unlock markets, we can get there faster. Then the second big learning actually builds on our colleague from South Africa, in that the power of the peer-to-peer education. So in our community, in our network, we have both leaders and learners. We tend to not have laggards because it's an opt-in community, but that the biggest growth of our community is in the next generation of customers. So often big companies will look at Walmart and say, well, of course Walmart can do that. They'll look at Google and say, of course Google can do that. Or Carrefour, these big international brands with big sophisticated energy teams. But what can I do? And so what's been really exciting to me, with 340 companies, a lot of them are much smaller companies. They're the suppliers to the big companies. And those learners are learning from the leaders. How do I do a power purchase agreement? How did you convince your chief financial officer to sign up to buy power for 10 years? Most companies don't buy commodities for more than 12 months at a time, if even 12 months. Maybe it's 1 month. How did you convince them to do that? How did you decide whether to put solar on your roof or do a power purchase agreement for a wind project 100 miles away? And so that peer-to-peer learning has been a critical part of the community. I could go on, but I'll pass the question to the next person.
Maybe before you go on, just a little bit about some of the challenges of actually bringing people together, the coalition side of things. Yeah.
Yes, it's a great question.
Or the opportunities, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, of course, whenever you have a coalition, you have organizations and people with different needs, right? And when you're working in different parts of the world, people have different needs and different areas of focus. And I'm sure that this is true in your organizations as well. Even in the United States, if we've got some members who really want to focus on the parts of the country that they don't have market access. In the United States, there are parts of our country where there's no market access. Some of our members want to focus there. Other members want to focus more on what's after the PPA. So finding ways to provide value to a very broad community, a broad constituency, is not always easy. And I would also say that, like Resource, our community also includes the supplier side. So while we are a customer-built, customer-driven organization, about 40% of our membership are energy suppliers. And when you have an energy customer community that also includes energy suppliers, there's often tension about value. So the suppliers really want to come and sell to the customers. The customers want a place where they're not sold to. So there's some tension there as well. And anytime you have a coalition that's broad and has different constituencies, you have to manage different interests.
Good. Thank you so much. And I think there are lessons there to be had. No, I think you can hear me quite well. I think I'm keeping the mic close. As I was saying, there are many lessons there to be had if we wanted to move in this direction in African markets, where I think there's a lot of appetite growing around the just energy transition and what that means for us. Maybe let me move on to Daniel, and you can tell us a little bit similarly on the challenges that the private sector is facing when trying to procure the renewable energy, and what is required from government and other players. You said you had a coalition of both suppliers and buyers. So what are you seeing in sort of the dynamic in the market as well? Good.
The first thing, sorry, try to be a little bit far away from the mic. I think it's okay now.
Yes, it's okay.
The first thing that we hear from the various stakeholders that we work with is we need a stable regulatory framework, because it gives us long-term visibility over how the market hopefully is going to evolve. And this then brings a lot of security for the investors putting the money for those renewable energy projects to go online. And the experience that we have to achieve this, first of all, you need a constant dialogue with the policymakers. But you cannot do it as an individual company here and there. You cannot just go or knock on the doors of the policymakers trying to basically put individual companies' agendas most of the time. What we see in Europe is when you have a single voice of the corporate buyers, and especially when this is harmonized with the voice of the suppliers in the market, then you achieve the best results in terms of policy making on a European market scale. And this is one of the key lessons actually that we learned. Putting different types of stakeholders together, working together on legislation, and then conveying the right messages to policymakers really helped us create a certain level of stability, but also understanding that a single decision from a single company in the European market that actually influenced a lot of projects even in other countries, because a policy signal from a single company in one side of Europe, let's say in Western Europe, can actually lead to a lot of decisions that are being taken then in Eastern Europe, for example, Central Europe, and then projects that maybe initially not affected at the beginning of a certain legislation going on, it can affect projects later on. So this is one of the keys that we learned. The second challenge that we faced was corporate buyers and suppliers actually were not talking to each other probably 10 years ago enough. We realized that there's a lot of demand. Corporates do want to provide, to procure renewable energy. Suppliers, of course, that's their business. They want to have new clients. They want to create new business models. But when we talk to them separately, they're like, in fact, we're not talking to each other that often. And one of the things that we established is actually to create a conference, we call it the Resource event, which focuses entirely on connecting renewable energy buyers and sellers. It's a platform where an exchange of ideas, exchange of concept can happen, but also co-creation of content, co-creation of knowledge. In fact, this conference led us to the development of template contracts for corporate PPAs that are now used in Europe, especially by smaller companies who are really starting now their journey in terms of the procurement of renewable energy. You need some sort of a simplification. You need some sort of standardization to help them really take off. So in addition to this, we realize that very often the procurement processes could be so complicated that unless you provide the right forum for exchange with multiple suppliers and understanding what is the right model, what is the right supplier for the buyer, nothing will happen on the market. So again, peer-to-peer exchange, fully agree. Not only suppliers and buyers are actually essential for the development of the market. In fact, communication and exchange between buyers and buyers, suppliers and suppliers, sometimes competitors sitting together on a round table. This is really making a difference on the market, and that's what we experienced in Europe. 10 years ago, there were almost no PPA signed in Europe. Today, the PPA market is growing tremendously. There are challenges. One of the challenges is on the regulation side, especially when there are market interventions. What we believe in our position is any market intervention that is being introduced by the policymakers should be very carefully analyzed and should be discussed with the industry before it's really implemented. Because what we see is there's sometimes a timing issue. A certain regulation that is being suggested or is planned to be implemented in a week or in a month or in a year actually has a different timeline in terms of how the market is actually developing. I mean, the market is moving with a different pace. Very often the market is moving faster than the regulations, and that is creating a discrepancy. And that's something that we also communicate very clearly to policymakers, that there should be a more regular dialogue. There should be better understanding to ensure that the right regulation is implemented also in the right time. Okay. And maybe last but not least, another lesson that we learned is that there is no one solution for all, right? Every market has its own particularities. Every market has, its own players. There are players, obviously, who are active all around Europe, and we support their development on a pan-European basis. But what we realize that we need to be working also with the local players, with the local organizations who understand how, when a law is implemented on European scale, how this can be adopted to the realities of the local markets, because that will have the biggest impact also locally. And essentially, this is how we believe the market is going to grow continuously. Also fully agree with opening the markets. In order to do that, you need to have the right market signals, right? And we see that in Europe, and we hope that this will continue very strong in the coming years.
Thank you so much. You covered quite a lot there, Daniel. And, I think, just getting a sense of the breadth and the depth of the sort of experimentation, the lessons learning, developing and designing tools that can be utilized across the market. I liked your point about some level of standardization, but also still tailored in many ways so that you're meeting the needs where the demands are, and making sure that you're relevant to local contexts. So some really good lessons there. Rotimetse, you're the one who's working in South Africa, which is a complicated environment, currently, with a lot of issues around access to energy more broadly. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of the challenges with working with your organization in an emerging market like South Africa.
I think the South African market has been quite interesting. For a long time, we've been pushing for a greater range of energy sources.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
A greater range of energy sources, a greater liberalization of the market itself, and a range of things. Because it's been quite a highly structured and a highly regulated market that's not worked for the country thus far. So, we had focused a lot of our efforts on how do we utilize some of the channels that are available to us to be able to kind of procure renewables, but get a greater uptake of renewables in the sector. Just worried about if there's any feedback. And that in itself was a really complex undertaking, because the regulatory environment seemed to hint at some ability to be able to access renewables, mechanisms such as wheeling, but even the kind of permission system. And then what I found is that all of a sudden, all of that was removed. So the companies that were able to procure renewables and generate renewables on site were far better positioned to be able to play a role in this. And so you've seen from having caps of 100 megawatts in terms of self-generation. Now you've got the private sector contributing up to 9 gigawatts of renewables. That's the current pipeline, but most of it focused on self-generation and likely then your mining companies and so forth. Then you've had this other aspect where we need to be able to open up the market so that you have a greater range of actors being able to procure, to generate electricity as well. The work that I mentioned that we did on the pathways where renewables were identified as that's the foundation of South Africa's economy, and that's something that we must get right. And we were looking at a case of bringing on board about 6 gigawatts of renewables year on year from now until 2050, which is a huge amount considering that over the past 10 years we've been able to do about 5 gigawatts. But I think it's also telling that you've got private sector actors who are already able to bring on board about 9 gigawatts in the near future. But there's the limitations towards on how we achieve this broader renewables uptake and really transform our market. You've got issues around grid access, particularly if you want to go national utility scale. But in the interim, you've got really good grid connectivity in key areas. And so that means that you have to open up the market a little bit more and find the mechanisms. It's the contracting, it's the type of PPAs that are signed. It's working with other actors beyond the national utility, and I spoke a little bit about local government in particular. If you want to, go into kind of arrangements that allow for wheeling, it's about thinking quite proactively around what sorts of tools and mechanisms, can be opened up to allow this hungry and this willing and waiting constituency that wants to procure renewables to be able to do so. And so we found that the complexity has been in, I think there's a case of kind of managing the pace between the willing, procurement actors in the corporate sector, but the other actors who need to be capacitated, who need then to start having a degree of comfort as well around how they would be able to manage such relationships and markets. And so we focus very much on I think, a degree of trust building, but also a degree of innovation. So providing those platforms, for example, we're working with the Western Cape government. We are now starting a relationship with the Gauteng government on how we bring the procurement of the corporates, their expertise as well, into structuring markets beyond the national level, and really plugging into those opportunities that are most immediately available in terms of grid access and connectivity, but also demonstrating that from subnational governments, which are typically not as well positioned or well capacitated as your national government, that the demand is sufficient to warrant their investment in this area, and really to start getting practical interventions up and running that are bringing both of those parties to the table.
Slowly. Uh, Thank you so much for that. I think you outlined a number of issues here. The regulations, the policies, grid access that you speak about, and South Africa's needing to rethink its entire renewable energy sector, really. And the opportunities for things that you can do off-grid as much as you can do sort of on-grid. So I think it'll be great to hear a little bit more about that from you in terms of the opportunities you're seeing, specifically at the local level for some of the off-grid, energy, and how maybe coalitions of this nature could kind of drive that a little bit forward as well. So maybe just reflect a bit on that.
Okay, so I'm happy to speak to that. So it's one of the interventions that we're really looking at where there is already grid infrastructure in place, grid access, and where we've seen a degree of kind of willingness and positioning of the relevant authority to really activate this part of their economy, but also the energy security issues as well are speaking very strongly to this. So, I mean, we've seen, I think the Western Cape is probably the most advanced, and we've used this conversation of how we're able to bring to the table, to conversations with government, so co-creating. We've brought in kind of their strategy units, the envisioning units, but also, I think importantly, there's been quite a clear statement from the government level in terms of what they want to do. So there's a clear vision and a clear acknowledgement that the private sector needs to play a role.
Yeah.
Then I think that the second element of this, so you've started to bring willing partners to the table together in a way that I don't think we've actually managed to do. We've had the very big national procurement program, but there's a greater degree of agency that we're seeing at other jurisdictions, and then really starting to activate some of their levers. So one of the things that we're really focusing on in the Western Cape, I think in addition to what has been, I think, quite straightforward in the sense that we've been calling for greater access to renewables and so forth. So that kind of willingness, it's almost as though the dam wall has broken.
Yes.
But now how you've elevated that conversation, and in the context of South Africa, where there's the energy access, there's jobs, there's skills, and how we are using that renewable energy opportunity where, I mean, the technologies are proven, there's some degree of confidence within the financial sector because we've kind of tested it. We are innovating a little bit more on how some of the PPAs may need to change, or the form of contracting to suit that level of government. We're bringing in technical expertise from the private sector in terms of retired either engineers or financiers to see how the municipal systems also need to kind of reshape, or how they can focus a little bit more to enable the municipalities to participate in this transaction, as opposed to it just being led from the private sector, who are essentially rejecting those government services. There's a question of revenue generation in the power sector, so bringing together those two actors in the conversation has now brought in another dimension that I think that just adds to the stability of the country, to the stability of the governance systems at that level. And then the last part that I was talking about around skills and things like that. So as we are establishing and with really mobilizing these different stakeholders in one locality, in one area, we're starting to unearth the opportunities around skills development and installations in other parts of the value chain. That adds another level of benefit, a dimension to what just transitions actually mean at a localized level. And this is all very much hinged on the demonstration from the corporate sector in particular that they want to be a part of the renewables conversation. They want to procure, they want to test out different models, and this depends on whichever particular area that they're located in, and perhaps what is most suitable. And just actively working with that ecosystem, those ecosystem elements, to get the renewables, but to really profile the broader benefits of having this transition take place, from skills, from the capacity, from the economic value as well, for the municipality and the locality. So I think, and then that of course brings its own challenges, but it also is such a wonderful opportunity, that shows how this green economy really is a green economy, and in our case, the inclusion is so important, the activation of the innovation is so key, and that co-creation process, is something that we are looking forward to developing even further as we implement.
Thank you so much. That's really exciting. And I think there are many lessons there to be had across the rest of Africa, actually, and particularly in the countries that don't have as a well-established sort of national grid as South Africa does. I think there's opportunities for some experimentations in terms of the partnerships, the co-creation of the energy sector across Africa. But let me move on to Tom here. As a corporation yourself, what are you seeing as some of the challenges of reaching your net zero targets, but not just as a corporation, but for your whole ecosystem, as it were?
Yeah, no, we're going to get it right eventually, aren't we? So I think I'll talk some things that we're doing on the global scale, and then some specific examples with Massmart. I think pulling quite a few points around working with suppliers, the SME supply chain, around education. The best example for that is the Walmart Project Gigaton, which aims to reduce or avoid 1 billion metric tons of carbon emissions. But I think it started as this big ambition, but what it's become is this network of suppliers. So I think, let me have to check my notes, from our recent reports, 4,500 suppliers are part of the network now, learning, sharing, discussing ideas on a raft of different topics, from the climate, from the renewables, nature, etc. So I think that's just one example. I think absolutely it was acknowledged from a retail point of view that we had to work with our supply chain. And there, within Project Gigaton, a whole range of suppliers. So I think that's a really good case study on that. And still plenty of work to be done, still more suppliers to get on board, etc. I think what's been really fascinating from learning more about the Massmart journey is I think they were one of the early adopters of presenting plans and releasing statements and providing ambitious goals in the market. And I think that's really important in sending market signals, both in terms of their own operations, and I think they've managed to do. Let me just get on my notes again. I think they've managed to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions by 25% since 2016. So they've been Can you go? How's that? Better?
Keep going.
Keep going. So they've done some fantastic work, not only on their own operations, which obviously as a retailer we've got a lot more control over, but I think this is the key other point is our customers, and around providing cost-effective products to help support the renewable journey. So those could be energy-efficient light bulbs or a range of different products. And I think that's a key bit in this debate as well, is about educating the customer. Not only just informing them about the right choices, but just actually providing the right kind of products that are affordable. And I think that's key both in the South African market, but also globally as well. That this transformation has to come not only with our own operations, not only with our suppliers, but also for our customers as well. I think that's a really kind of key point to make.
I like your point about educating the customer as well. And that kind of touches on what Rutimetse mentioned around skills building, around the just transition. And, we're UNDP, and one of our, mantras is leaving no one behind. I just want to ask, all of you on the panel, perhaps to reflect a little bit beyond the initial objective of trying to accelerate investment into renewable energy, but also the broader SDG impacts that you're seeing coming out of the work that you're doing, the shift, the transitioning of whole economies. And I want you to reflect perhaps a little bit, for Africa, as a market, you're looking at economies and markets where you still have about between 40 and 60% of the population with no access to energy. So how can we use these sorts of coalitions to expand that coverage, but also think about the broader SDG impacts? Now, I really must apologize about this feedback, but if you can pass the mic and maybe not point it that side, then maybe it'll be a bit better. But maybe let me start with you, Miranda, to reflect on some of those issues. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll try to point it up. And my device doesn't have any Wi-Fi, so I wonder if maybe that's why I'm not.
I've hidden mine.
And your questions as well. So we know that access to reliable, modern power is absolutely fundamental to all aspects of human development. And while the number of people that have no access to any power has improved greatly in the last 20 years, when I started work in this space, it was 2 billion people with no access to modern power. Now it's 700 million. So that number has gotten dramatically improved. However, it's not just a solar panel with a light bulb so a child can read a book. That number from 2 billion to 700 million is just basic access to power. And if you change the way you're measuring to a level of power that actually supports economic development, that actually supports cold supply chains to keep vaccines cold from distribution to local health center, that actually supports small businesses to have things like sewing machines or electronic devices to run their businesses, The number without access to economically supporting electricity is much higher. I was trying to find my notes because I just heard this stat earlier this week, and it's much higher than 700 million. So when we think about the next generation of clean power, we've been talking for actually decades now about how modular and distributed renewable energy can be. And when we look at how much the price of renewable energy, wind, solar, storage, moving water, geothermal, how much those prices have come down, that now we can start looking at building 21st century energy solutions, not the 20th century, the way the West did it, which is big and centralized and dirty and inefficient. So there's real opportunity, but we know that without access to basic power, none of the other SDGs are possible. Yeah. These are issues that are true in all markets. In the United States, we have some parts of our economy that are quite impoverished, and often those communities sit with the coal industry and in the natural gas industry. And one of the things that President Biden just did in his most recent, and the Congress did in the most recent Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, is there's all kinds of provisions that give added incentive, added tax subsidies, added grants, added support for renewable energy development in regions that need to transition from coal and gas. And so that's also potentially a model we could look at replicating in other parts of the world, because it's focused on empowerment. It's focused on reskilling and new skilling workers. Anyway, this is a passion of mine. We don't work on this too much at SEBA, but we do some. We have a program called Beyond the Megawatt, which looks at all of the other components of clean energy deployment in addition to greenhouse gas reductions. So it looks at equity issues where projects are being built. It looks at equity issues and labor rights issues in the clean energy supply chain. If we're building a solar project in Nigeria, there could be mining impacts in China, right? So we need to look at the labor rights issues across the whole supply chain. Our Beyond the Megawatt initiative looks at the other environmental impacts of clean energy deployment, whether it is where the project's being built or where the raw materials are being mined, right? So we know that all of these things are interrelated.
It's really great. Particularly your last point there, I think you're absolutely right. And as we're reimagining the energy sector in the countries that we're thinking of, we do need to remember all of the way things are so interconnected. And we always talk about a holistic ecosystem approach, but often we miss some elements. But maybe, Daniel, you can tell us a little bit of your reflections on the same sort of question.
First of all, I fully agree with some of the statements that you make, and if I can build on that, all of them. I think if I can build on that, the way we see it in Europe, to support local communities, we need to start moving from a very centralized system to a more decentralized system. Because in fact, renewable energy technology is very versatile, it's very flexible, in many cases very easy to install. And we believe scale can be achieved by big projects, by large-scale solar, wind projects, etc. But to achieve net zero, we also need these small distributed systems to be installed to ensure that we are moving with the right pace and the right scale. And these are actually the systems that, in our opinion, can help the most local communities, because solar on buildings, solar on carports, solar on fences, and this is just one of the technologies can really help also the communities understand, okay, what does it mean to switch towards renewables? What does it mean to have a more an economy where renewable energy technology is playing a key role, especially in the energy mix? So decentralization, in our opinion, is the way to go, so that local communities can actually have an easy access, easy understanding of what renewable energy means for those local communities. Now, in addition to this, a key challenge for us as a sector, as a renewable energy sector, especially in Europe, is having enough workers with the right skills. So I really, really agree with the statement that we need to be investing not only in renewables but also in education. We started talking to a lot of universities recently because jobs creation, education, the right skills is becoming really on top of the agenda of many of the project developers that we're working with, suppliers and so on. And after we started talking to education providers, education institutions, we realized that in fact not enough specialized programs that are targeting the challenges of our sector. There are not enough specialized programs that are really inspiring younger people who are going to be needed. I mean, this is workforce that is going to be needed in the coming years to be able to grow with the pace and with the scale that we need to in order to reach net zero. And the key to this, in our opinion, is really establishing partnerships between, obviously, the business sector, the different institutions, the governments, but also the education sector to create the right programs, the right courses, to have the right communication on a local level, to inspire people, obviously, to start their careers in the sector, but also to have a movement of people from one industry to the other. There's so many people who are working in other sectors, in very often, let's say, conventional energy sectors, and we believe that those people have a role to play in the renewable energy space. We don't want one sector to basically kill job opportunities for another. We want to have a transition in which those people are taken care of. And basically the renewable energy sector can contribute with developing programs together with universities, training centers, so that skills can be provided in addition to existing skills that, of course, you can harvest from different sectors, but really adapting them to the needs of the current market. So skills education is indeed a key that we believe should be utilized. But also the power of the brands, especially consumer brands. We are very confident that brands should be communicating to local communities about the direct impact that renewable energy projects can have on those local communities. First of all, from a job creation, very often renewable energy projects are developed obviously outside of the cities, and they require people to assist with development, maintenance, etc., who live locally. And by communicating clearly that brands do not only invest in renewables so that they can supply the cheapest form of electricity for their operations, but they also want to support local job creation. They want to support local skilling. I think this is really, really key, and we're very, very fond of working with big brands, especially consumer brands, so that we have a consistent story that renewables is good for the economy, it's good for the business, but it's also good for the local community, because it creates education opportunities, it creates job opportunities, it creates stable opportunities, because the renewable energy sector is going to grow. I think we all agree, but what we're afraid of, we might not have enough people to develop all the projects that we need to develop. We might have the financing, we might have the political will, when we might not have enough people to work on those projects. And I think this is what we want to bring as a message on a local level.
Thank you so much. I think that's really extremely important. And I was just triggered when you were talking about the fact that, you are wanting to make the power of the brand, making this communication. In a lot of cases, the issue with access to energy is about affordability for a lot of the communities we're working with. And the extent to which a large corporation can come into an area, set up their operations, create sort of a renewable energy source, but also use some of their sort of economic power to subsidize energy for the communities around them. I think that's a really interesting, for me, a really interesting development model, because then you can then start to look at going beyond just basic energy access for those communities, but giving them an opportunity to create an income. So I can see a development project coming out of this very soon, very soon. And as UNDP, we'd certainly be willing to have a conversation about this a little bit more. But maybe let me keep this moving, because I'm noticing our time. Let's have a conversation from Retimetse, and you can tell us a little bit about some of the broader, I mean, you were already touching on this as you were explaining the work at the municipal level, some of the broader impacts you're seeing in the discussions and the conversations you're having within the National Business Initiative in South Africa, beyond the megawatts, beyond the access to the renewable energy. Yes.
Yeah. So as I think I kind of mentioned right at the beginning, how we've positioned the conversation around renewables really is that this is the next development trigger for South Africa, and it's a critical one that we need to get right. We've got really severe energy security issues at the moment, and the quickest, the cheapest, the most effective way of addressing those those energy security challenges that we're facing, it's renewables. So this is a fundamental kind of economic, social imperative. So you want to keep the economy running. We need to be able to recover from some of the impacts of COVID. So this positioning that the investment in renewables and a whole range of things, it really is going to define our development going forward, and it underpins our competitiveness as an economy and what the economy needs to support, I think, more broadly in the social space. So I think this is a critical positioning of the renewable energy conversation, which has then allowed us to be able to start to think at a national systemic level. So many of the issues you've been highlighting around the skills component, reskilling, upskilling, educating. We looked at a whole range of how our transition, being a coal-fired power station kind of based economy that's undergoing a radical shift. You've got 60% of jobs in the mining sector, for example, at risk. So how do you manage some of those transitions? And I think the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's moved from a climate conversation or an environment conversation or a local Mpumalanga conversation where most of our coal-fired power stations are located. But these are now national conversations. And these are national conversations that are going to shape, even from a social protection perspective, as you're shifting from one form of energy to another, it just calls on the activation of such big systems that we're going to have to deal with, that it's going to define, it is already defining how we will handle things like social protection. It's social protection in the context of energy transitions. It's about managing cultural dislocations and geographic dislocations as people move from one area to another. It's about how do you reshape your education system and supporting mechanisms around the education and skills space to focus on what must be done, and that's really getting the 6 gigawatts on an annual basis up and running. And so I think from one perspective, this huge transition, this shift in thinking, this activation in terms of how South Africa sees itself, the systems it has to put in place, is really defined by the renewable energy conversation. And then maybe if I go at a less grand scale, just to talk about some of the things that we are looking at and how the renewables conversation is really at the core of it. And I'm reflecting on some of the work that our companies that we work with are doing in rolling out renewables in their space. So the one about how do you then get communities to be able to own the means of generating wealth. This is a big conversation in South Africa, and this whole dynamic then of how companies are situated and located within their communities and the role that they are playing. and the interactions and engagements that they need to put in place. So it's renewables again, and there's the energy security and competitiveness aspect, but there's also a way of opening up the economic opportunities that are sitting in the space to a broader range of stakeholders. And these are things that our companies are engaged in, conversations that they have to have around, land ownership, but how does the community then start to benefit and play an active role in the ownership of these assets. Then there's other work that we're doing around, particularly in kind of township economies, which tend to be more informal, and they tend to be smaller as well. How, in areas where you're generating these assets, you're establishing these assets, do you link the surrounding communities with servicing these concentrated regions where renewables are prioritized, and putting in place the platforms that allow people to be able to service, I think, the industry that's growing around that. I think this has been something that's key and speaks to many of the SDGs and that you've indicated. Another dimension about that, I've mentioned it a little bit about the skills. So where you're starting to concentrate a lot of activity and investment in infrastructure, the scale component, we're able to link up with particularly our technical and vocational training institutions in actually designing and shaping curricula that will produce the technicians and the employees that you need to be able to run these companies, to be able to provide the services. And we use the linkages with the companies that we're working with to be able to provide experiential learning. So you start to create an ecosystem where people can get trained, can get direct exposure, and it starts to make it more real. People are more employable, plus they're able to service this growing opportunity. So these are very practical things that respond to those bigger social challenges, but really anchored in how we're thinking about renewables, and I think how companies are working with their communities, with their value chains. I think the Mass Smart and the Walmart examples are excellent showcases for that sort of thing. But bringing in a whole range of actors, at different skills levels and so forth. So there's a number of different conversations that are taking place at very macro scale, but become more and more granular, and being involved in those conversations has been key, and innovating around how do you actually make this practically possible. And in our spaces, as you learn and see what one company is doing, you bring other companies to the space to see how they can innovate, often very key players in their communities, and so being able to embed and leverage some of these experiences and insights on a fairly simple thing. I mean, if you're installing PV or whatever it is, but how it represents a much bigger, much more fundamental shift in our societies on a whole range of levels. If I can speak to one last example, so one of the other pieces of work that we do at the NBI is around it's an accelerator type program called the Climate Finance Accelerator, and it's about how do we start to build the businesses, obviously, that serve our transition, that serve the green economy, a resilient economy, and a key part of that. So in kind of shaping and putting out there the vision of what is the kind of company you want to see, what is the kind of company that's able to attract investment. Core to that is the inclusion of gender, equity, and social inclusion, and how that is practically a part of what is the value add of those companies. So in addition to providing the degree of support and capacity building to those businesses and organizations that will serve and really deliver the products and services that we need, I think this view of what makes a company a good company, where we focus specifically on those gender, the equity, and the social inclusion elements, is really been quite critical, and speaks to I think the vision and the mandate of the NBI.
Yeah.
That business has to be a part of shaping the kinds of societies we want. Those are societies that are competitive, they're resilient, they're inclusive, and there's spaces for all. And so you can see that manifested in different ways in the work that we try to get companies to lead.
extremely inspiring comments from you there, Ratimete, and absolutely, I really like the way you've brought in the equity angle to this conversation, and I think, I mean, that should really inspire us. Just looking at how, even with COVID, and how we saw that, you know, communities without access to energy, without access to digital infrastructure, were left behind in ways that we hadn't even conceptualized, that we weren't even aware of, and the risk of losing a generation of children in just basic schooling because of the fact that they had no access to energy, they had no access to digital, you know, infrastructure, and able to access, you know, knowledge, information, and move with everybody else. So I mean, I can see definitely some very important points. It's been a long week. Some very important points that you're raising there, and really inspirational, just how you are utilizing, you know, the ethos of business being inclusive, being about communities, doing business well, but doing good with your business as well. I think that's excellent. Tom, you know, I'm sticking with the same theme, really, looking at what you as Walmart and with your ecosystem are doing that goes beyond just the access to renewable energy, but also going beyond that, how you're influencing other corporations as well. So maybe you can look at that.
Yeah, okay. I've turned my Wi-Fi off, so I think that stopped the interception. I think some of the comments that were made earlier just about this kind of holistic picture, because I think certainly, you know, obviously, as we've been talking about, a huge amount of work on renewables, but we're looking at waste, circular economy, on climate, on human rights. You know, there's a whole range of it. So to probably just highlight how all these things come together, there's kind of 4 key topics that touch on all these points, and how we kind of group together all this thinking and try and intertwine them. So I think one is economic opportunity. That's what we're just all talking about. Secondly, sustainability, which is covering renewables and waste and plastics and all sorts of different things. Then there's community, again, another topic we were talking about. And then finally, kind of ethics and integrity, which talk about policy and anti-corruption and governance and things like that. And all these pieces come together. You kind of do have to look at the whole picture, because there's so much cross-learnings between all these different topics. There's so much, you know, we're talking about community and economic opportunity with renewables, and the same thing. You know, we're going to be attending the first global negotiation on plastics treaty next week. Again, there's a massive discussion on community impact, economic opportunity to do with plastics. So all these topics share the same kind of frameworks, and I think we can really learn a lot by looking at things holistically, and again, across the social agenda as well. I think on how we're working with others, I mean, TIBA is a perfect example, and again, across all these different topics, even with Walmart's size and scale, we can't do this alone, and that just kind of shows you. So I think if we can't get it done at our size and scale, but I think it is about leveraging that market influence, leveraging that global recognition, and bringing other people together to either say, oh, well, if they're doing it, we can do it, or it's to say, you know, Walmart's a key customer or a potential customer. There's a huge leveraging power in that. And I think we try and use that as much as we can across all these different agendas to try and inspire others.
Thank you so much. I can see you want to add a few things. Sure, Miranda.
So I have 2, maybe 3 very specific examples to the question you've posed around how can companies, particularly those larger, more established brands, go beyond their own operations. So one example, building on the idea that you put forward, Joanne, of can a company be sort of an anchor customer on a renewable energy project, but have the developer size the project larger so that the broader community has access to zero marginal cost, zero carbon, solar or wind. And there's actually a Walmart example. 2 of my examples are Walmart, in part because I used to work there. So in full disclosure, there's a Walmart example. This is a US example in the state of Georgia, where there was regulations that made it almost impossible for renewable energy to be deployed. Walmart went in with their lobbying power and their brand and their buying power, got the laws changed such that they could build a community solar project. used their strong credit worthiness and bankability to be the anchor client of that solar project, but it was oversized so that the local, these were very small communities, the local schools and the local daycare centers and grocery stores and banks could also have access, even if they weren't as bankable, even if they didn't have the brand. So that's a model that could be replicated really almost anywhere in the world. Another example is we are seeing more of these large brands that have large energy loads doing what we call aggregated deals with smaller companies and their suppliers, where 4 or 5 companies come together. And Salesforce has done this, Apple has done this, as well as many others, where you have one company who has the balance sheet, the size to be able to say, you know, I can buy 50 megawatts of this 75 megawatt project, and then we'll sell the other 25 to these 4 smaller companies who maybe don't have the same bankability. And that again gives the financiers confidence in the group, the sort of basket. That's another model that could be replicated in other parts of the world. And then third is actually more in energy efficiency, and it has to do with supply chains, and this is my second Walmart example. But Walmart's not the only one doing this. Many of the big companies that have global supply chains are going into their supply chain factories and sharing best practices, even on basic things like advanced lighting or advanced heating and cooling systems. It may sound strange, but buildings managers, facility managers, you build a relationship with the old technology because you know how it works, you know how to maintain it. So even something as simple as changing from a 10-year-old cooling system, HVAC system, to a more modern HVAC system, that can be scary for a building manager. So having their customer come in and say, well, this is what we've done, and this is how LED lights have worked for us, or this is how LED lights with skylights so that the LED lights can dim as the sun goes overhead has worked for us, and sharing those learnings to the supply chain partners can also be a good example. So those were 3 practical examples of your question of how can the global brands go beyond their own 4 walls.
Fantastic. That's exactly what we're looking at. And that brings us to a really, good sort of culmination of the conversation. I've learned a hell of a lot just from hearing your reflections. You saw me taking copious notes. It's not because I'm going to be summarizing, it's because I'm going to be studying afterwards. But I just wanted to give each of you maybe 5 minutes, maybe starting with Tom and then ending with you, Miranda, just to sum up from your perspective. If I was wanting to enter into the African emerging market, where a lot of this conversation is still very nascent, there are still lots of voices and lots of different perspectives, and still some basic challenges, right, that we are grappling with. What would be your top two or top 3, hints? You need to point it this way, point it to you. Yeah, it's reflecting off the speakers, sorry. But what would your top 2 pieces of advice be? Whether that's you're giving that advice to other corporates or to government, it's up to you. But perhaps you could just give us your sort of top 3, here's how you might want to tackle some of these things. Thank you.
Lucky to go first then, so these guys get a chance to think about it and bring up things that are cleverer than me. I think it kind of echoes a lot of the points that have already been made. I think really this bit that there is a huge amount of information out there already for companies, for individuals, for policymakers to cut and paste, and there's nothing shameful about that. I think what we find is that there can be a slight, without any shadow of a doubt, there's local contexts to all these challenges and opportunities, but at the same time there's huge lessons that can be learned and transferred from other countries, other sectors, other issues as well. You look on collaboration, often we'll find in markets they don't want to compete, they don't want to discuss with other competitors because they're sort of like, well, they're competitors and you can't talk to them. There are so many examples out there of competitors working with each other that
Yeah.
have absolutely no problem.
Yeah.
And I think, but sometimes people and industries can think, well, we're unique, we're new, this is different here. But the reality is, there are always local nuances, but the reality is it's probably been tried, tried somewhere else, it's probably not worked in another place. There's just so much out there already. And just asking other industry bodies, other governments, other policymakers, other industries, and just appreciating that there isn't just this kind of, that you're not the first to ask these questions. And there's so much out there to learn from others and build on what's been done.
Thank you for that. And that really underscores the point which we're making right from the beginning. Coalition, come together, learn from each other. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. Ritimetse.
I would definitely echo that sentiment. I mean, at the NBI, we've worked with the colleagues from Rescale and RE100, and that's been quite a learning experience for me as well. And we've seen in that kind of a context, and with the work that we do specifically on RAISE, but it builds very much on those coalitions. That just having that community of, I think, inspiration. It's also a community of support. It's a community of enlightenment. It's a wonderful thinking space. So where you see these platforms that exist, I think it's a wonderful idea to join in and be part of those conversations. It's really such a magnificent tool and opportunity. And then my second piece of advice would be, given the context and the opportunities that have already been highlighted and the potential impact, I think when things get difficult, just to reflect that, on the fact that this is your moment to do something really great. And yeah, it will be difficult, but the reward, beyond your own energy security, but the significance of the actions that companies are taking when they establish renewables, and are part of that collective action, I think is something that's really fantastic. And it will, bear great rewards for those companies.
Thank you so much for that. Dave.
My message to Africa is be bolder than Europe. I believe that the potential for the renewable energy sector in Africa is massive. And my message is be bolder than Europe. Take leaps of faith. Do not take small steps as we did in Europe, because that was our lesson. Now we need to be running instead of walking, to fix some of the problems that we created. But my message is just be bolder. The second message, and maybe the second tip that I'd like to give, is there's no such thing as, too many regulations is good or no regulation is good. Balanced approach to policy making and regulation, I think it's key. Government should be working with the business, but also with local communities. You cannot exclude any of those stakeholders if you want to develop the market. And last but not least, local communities should be playing a much bigger role in creating the story for renewables in Africa, because I do believe that they can bring also so much power in addition to the power of the brands, and this is, I believe, how the market can grow at scale, and this is how it can create positive value and change.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That's really good.
So I'm one of those people that believes in repeating a good idea. I also had the same idea that the number one message is to work in coalition. And rather than not saying it again, I'm going to say it again because I think it shows how important it is that it was one of the key points of all four of us.
Yeah.
So work in coalitions of businesses, work in joint coalitions of businesses and governments. And I failed to mention that last week we launched something called the Clean Energy Demand Initiative, which is a diplomatic and corporate initiative that was launched last year at Glasgow. There are 14 country governments engaged with the U.S. government, Department of State, including South Africa and Nigeria, are the only two governments on the African continent at this time part of the Clean Energy Demand Initiative Coalition. And there are about 80 corporations involved. So we were hoping to have some Nigerian colleagues here today to talk about that, but we weren't able to succeed in that. So work in coalition, number one. Particularly find coalitions that bring together the private sector and the government sector, because the regulations and laws and market structures make such a big difference. And I guess I'll just finish by saying thank you again for pulling this together. I'm particularly delighted to learn about the National Business Initiative in South Africa. It seems like the perfect home for the South African version of what we're talking about, and I think there's so much opportunity for coalitions to work in coalition. So we can have partnerships between what we're doing so that we can all learn from one another. So thank you again for hosting us.
What a pleasure and what a delight to have all of you. And as I said, I learned a lot in the conversation itself. But also some really great opportunities for future work. One of the things and the reason why UNDP put up this panel and really wanted to have a conversation with you is that we are seeing the emergence of a need across Africa for this kind of work. A lot of people across Africa are working with power producers, but very little around the demand side of power. And I think this is an excellent opportunity. I will be following up with all of you, especially to think through what would a coalition in Africa look like. And maybe at COP28, I'd look forward to being able to launch something in partnership with all of you as well. And I'm throwing this out there because I think it's UNDP's role to kind of pioneer some of these things and provide that platform for this kind of convening. So thank you all again, from the bottom of our hearts as UNDP and for myself personally. It's been riveting. It's been really interesting. Thank you all very, very much. Okay. Till next year.